December 30th, 2025. 4 a.m. local time. The port of Mukalla sleeps under a sky still dark with night. This ancient city on Yemen's southern coast has seen centuries of trade, of empires rising and falling, of ships carrying goods between Arabia and the Indian Ocean. Tonight, 2 vessels sit at anchor. Their cargo holds full. The first explosion tears through the pre-dawn silence. Then another. And another. By the time the sun rises over the Gulf of Aden, black smoke billows from the port. Vehicles burn. Containers lie scattered like toys thrown by an angry child. The ships that arrive under cover of darkness will never complete their delivery. This is not an attack by the Houthi rebels who control northern Yemen. This is not a strike by a foreign power. This is Saudi Arabia bombing a shipment from the United Arab Emirates, 2 nations that have been allies for decades, 2 nations that launched a joint military intervention in Yemen together in 2015. 2 nations whose rulers have embraced publicly, whose flags have flown side by side, whose wealth has flowed from the same oil-soaked earth. Now one has bombed the other. The attack on Mukalla port is not just a military operation. It is a declaration, a message written in fire and steel. A line drawn in the sand that cannot be undrawn. After years of tensions kept behind closed doors, whispered disagreements and quiet competition, the rupture between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates has burst into the open. And Yemen, poor, shattered, starving Yemen is once again the battlefield where others settle their scores. This is a story of how 2 of the Middle East's most powerful nations went from partners to adversaries. How an alliance forged and shared interests fractured under the weight of competing ambitions. How the war in Yemen transformed from a campaign against a common enemy into a proxy conflict between erstwhile friends, and how the consequences may reshape the entire region for decades to come. To understand the rupture, you must first understand the bond. A decade ago, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were more than allies. They were partners in a shared vision of what the Middle East should be. They saw the same threats. They feared the same enemies. They dreamed the same dreams of regional dominance. The threats were clear. Iran's expanding influence, spreading through proxies across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, which both kingdoms viewed as existential dangers to their model of authoritarian stability. The chaos of the Arab Spring, which had toppled governments and threatened to sweep away the old order entirely. Against these threats, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi stood together. They backed the same counter-revolutionary forces in Egypt after the military coup of 2013. They imposed a punishing blockade on Qatar in 2017, accusing their smaller neighbor of supporting Islamist movements. They coordinated their oil policies, their diplomatic initiatives, their security strategies. And in March 2015, they launched Operation Decisive Storm. The Houthi movement, an Iran Shia insurgency from Yemen's northern highlands, had swept across the country, seizing the capital Sana'a and threatening to overrun the entire nation. The internationally recognized government fled. Yemen, which shares a long and porous border with Saudi Arabia, seemed on the verge of becoming an Iranian client state. The intervention was supposed to be quick, a few weeks of airstrikes, a rapid ground campaign, and the restoration of the legitimate government. Saudi Arabia provided the bulk of the air power and the strategic direction. The UAE contributed ground forces, special operations units, and a reputation for military effectiveness that exceeded its small size. Together, they would crush the Houthis and secure the Arabian Peninsula's southern flank. That was 10 years ago. The war continues. The Houthis still control most of northern Yemen. Tens of thousands have died. Millions face famine. And somewhere along the way, the alliance that launched the intervention began to crack. The cracks appeared slowly. At first, they were barely visible. Differences in tactics, disagreements over priorities, the inevitable friction that arises when 2 proud nations attempt to coordinate a complex military campaign. But the differences were deeper than tactics. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had entered Yemen with different objectives. Riyadh wanted to defeat the Houthis and restore the internationally recognized government. It wanted stability on its southern border. It wanted to push back Iranian influence without fundamentally reshaping Yemen's political landscape. Abu Dhabi wanted something more. The UAE had ambitions that extended beyond defeating the Houthis. It sought to establish a permanent presence in southern Yemen, to control strategic ports along the Gulf of Aden, to project power across the Horn of Africa and into the Red Sea shipping lanes that carry so much of global trade. These ambitions led the Emirates to cultivate local allies. Chief among them was the Southern Transitional Council. The STC emerged in 2017, representing the aspirations of southern Yemenis who remembered when their region was an independent state, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, which existed from 1967 until unification with the North in 1990. Many Southerners had never fully accepted that unification. They felt marginalized by the Northern-dominated government, their resources extracted, their voices ignored. The UAE saw opportunity in their grievances. Abu Dhabi armed the STC, trained its fighters, funded its operations. The Emirates built the STC into the most effective military force in southern Yemen, more capable in many ways than the government troops that Saudi Arabia supported. This created an impossible situation. Saudi Arabia was backing the Yemeni government. The UAE was backing a movement that wanted to break away from that government. Both were supposedly fighting on the same side against the Houthis, but their proxies increasingly turned their guns on each other. The first major clash came in August 2019. STC forces seized the southern port city of Aden from government troops, temporarily capturing the presidential palace before a Saudi-brokered ceasefire restored an uneasy calm. The Riyadh agreement that followed was supposed to integrate the STC into the government structure, to paper over the differences, to maintain the fiction of a unified anti-Houthi coalition. It was a bandage on a wound that would not heal. December 2nd, 2025. The STC launches what it calls Operation Promising Future. The name carries bitter irony. For millions of Yemenis who have survived a decade of war, famine, and disease, the future has promised nothing but more suffering. But for the STC and its Emirati backers, this operation promises something very specific. Control of Yemen's eastern provinces. The offensive begins in Hadramaut. This is not random. Hadramaut is Yemen's largest governorate, a vast territory stretching from the coast deep into the desert interior. It contains significant oil reserves. Its port of Mukalla is a gateway to international shipping, and most importantly, it shares a long border with Saudi Arabia. STC forces move with surprising speed. Within days, they have seized Siyan, the historic city in the Wadi Hadramaut Valley. They take Tarim, with its famous mud brick architecture and ancient Islamic learning centers. Government forces, caught off guard, offer little resistance. The offensive expands into Al-Mara. This governorate occupies Yemen's far eastern corner, bordering both Saudi Arabia and Oman. It is sparsely populated but strategically vital. Whoever controls Al-Mara controls access routes that Saudi Arabia has long considered essential to its security. By December 9th, the SDC controls most of the territory that once comprised South Yemen. Nearly half of Yemen's land area, and two provinces, Hadramaut and Al-Mara, that Riyadh has explicitly declared are within its sphere of vital interest. The Saudis are furious. This operation was launched without consultation, without coordination, without any of the pretense of partnership that had characterized the coalition's public face. The SDC moved because the UAE gave it the means and the permission to move, and in doing so, Abu Dhabi crossed what Saudi Arabia considers a red line. For the first time, Riyadh publicly accuses its ally of threatening Saudi national security. The language is unprecedented. Saudi officials describe the UAE's actions as highly dangerous. They accuse Abu Dhabi of pressuring and directing the SDC to undermine the Yemeni state. They warn that any threat to Saudi national security will be met with all necessary measures. These are not the words allies use with each other. These are the words that precede conflict. The response comes on December 30. Saudi intelligence has tracked a shipment leaving the UAE. Two vessels carrying vehicles and containers cross the Gulf of Aden and enter the port of Mukalla, now under SDC control. Riyadh claims the cargo includes weapons and ammunition destined for STC forces. The coalition command makes a decision. At 4 a.m., Saudi aircraft strike the port. The vessels are Targeted vehicles burn. The message is delivered with explosive clarity. Saudi Arabia will not tolerate UAE military support for forces that threaten its interests. The UAE denies the ships carried weapons. Abu Dhabi claims the cargo consisted of vehicles destined for Emirati forces, not the STC. It expresses surprise at the strike and commitment to Saudi security. The denials are formal, diplomatic, and entirely unconvincing to anyone watching the situation closely. Hours after the strike, Yemen's internationally recognized government issues an ultimatum. All UAE forces must leave Yemen within 24 hours. The joint defense agreement that has governed Emirati military presence in the country is terminated. The government accuses Abu Dhabi of high treason against the Yemeni state. Saudi Arabia backs the ultimatum. This is the moment when the private rupture becomes public and irreversible. Riyadh is siding with the Yemeni government against its former coalition partner. The alliance that launched the intervention together is now fighting on opposite sides. The UAE announces it will withdraw. Abu Dhabi says it is ending its counter-terrorism mission in Yemen. It expresses deep regret at the Saudi accusations. But the withdrawal announcement is less a concession than a recognition of new realities. The direct Emirati military presence may end. The support for local proxies is unlikely to disappear. The STC still holds the territory it seized, and its leader, Adaris al-Zubaydi, still believes he can achieve what his movement has dreamed of for years. An independent southern Yemen, backed by the UAE, controlling the strategic waterways of the Gulf of Aden. He is about to discover the limits of that dream. January 7, 2026. Adaris al-Zubaydi is supposed to board a plane to Riyadh. The Saudis have demanded a conference. They want all Yemeni factions at the table. They want to impose a settlement that preserves some version of national unity. They want al-Zubaydi to come explain himself, to negotiate, to submit to Saudi arbitration. Al-Zubaydi does not board the plane. According to coalition officials, the STC leader escapes in the dead of night. He travels by sea from Aden to the port of Berbera in Somaliland, across the Gulf of Aden. There, he boards an aircraft with UAE officers. The plane flies to Mogadishu, then turns off its identification systems over the Gulf of Oman before landing at Al Reef military airport in Abu Dhabi. The escape is a humiliation for Saudi Arabia. It demonstrates that the UAE can still extract its allies from Yemen, can still operate in defiance of Saudi wishes, can still thumb its nose at Riyadh's demands. The elaborate route through Somaliland and Somalia, with transponders disabled, is almost theatrical in its audacity. Saudi Arabia responds with force. Coalition aircraft strikes NTC positions across southern Yemen. Ground forces loyal to the internationally recognized government advance on Aden, seizing the international airport, the presidential palace, and all entry and exit points. The STC fighters who dominated the city for years find themselves suddenly out. The Presidential Leadership Council strips al-Zubaydi of his membership. He is accused of high treason. The Attorney General is ordered to launch an investigation. The man who led the Southern movement for years is now a fugitive from the government he once served, sheltered by patrons whose protection may not be enough. And yet the crisis is far from resolved. Al-Zubaydi is in Abu Dhabi, but his fighters still hold territory. The UAE may have withdrawn its troops, but its money, weapons, and political support can still flow through other channels. The infrastructure of Emirati influence in southern Yemen was built over years. It will not disappear with a single announcement. Saudi Arabia has won a battle. The war for Yemen's future, and for dominance in the Gulf, has only begun. Yemen is not the only battlefield. The Saudi-UAE rupture extends across the Red Sea basin, through the Horn of Africa, into conflicts and competitions that most of the world barely notices. What appears on the surface as a disagreement over Yemeni factions is actually a fundamental clash over regional order. Consider Sudan. The civil war that erupted there in April 2023 pits the Sudanese armed forces against the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group that grew out of the Janjaweed militias. Saudi Arabia has aligned with the army. The UAE has been accused of supporting the RSF, charges Abu Dhabi denies, but which multiple investigations have documented. Consider Somalia. The UAE has built close ties with Somaliland. the breakaway region that declared independence from Somalia in 1991 but remains unrecognized by most of the world. Abu Dhabi is constructing a military base there, investing in port infrastructure, cultivating a relationship that could give the Emirates a foothold on both sides of the Gulf of Aden. Israel's recent recognition of Somaliland adds another layer. The decision, announced in late 2025, was condemned by Saudi Arabia and dozens of other nations. The UAE's name was notably absent from the list of critics. The silence spoke volumes. These are not isolated incidents. They are pieces of a pattern. The UAE has pursued an increasingly independent foreign policy, projecting power across the region through a network of ports, bases, and proxy relationships. Saudi Arabia, which once accepted Emirati ambitions as complementary to its own, now sees them as competitive and potentially threatening. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has priorities of his own. Vision 2030. The transformation of Saudi Arabia into a post-oil economy. These ambitions require stability on its borders, not the fragmentation of neighboring states into competing spheres of influence controlled by a rival. From Riyadh's perspective, the UAE's actions in Yemen crossed from competition into threat. Hadramaut and Al-Mara are not distant territories whose fate Saudi Arabia can accept with equanimity. They border the kingdom. They contain resources and routes that affect Saudi security directly. Emirati-backed forces controlling those provinces would give Abu Dhabi leverage over Riyadh that no Saudi leader could tolerate. The strike on Mukalla was not about ships and cargo. It was about drawing a line, about demonstrating that Saudi Arabia will use force against anyone, even its closest ally, who threatens its core interests. The message has been received. Whether it will be heeded is another question entirely. The world is watching. Energy markets have noted the confrontation between two of the world's largest oil exporters, both positioned near critical maritime choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supply passes, lies between them. The Bab al-Mandeb gateway to the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean is the prize being contested in Yemen. Any disruption to these waterways would send shockwaves through the global economy. The United States has called for restraint. Secretary of State Marco Rubio expressed concern at the recent events in southeastern Yemen and urged continued diplomacy. But the Trump administration has also designated Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally and approved the sale of F-35 fighter jets to the kingdom. Washington's sympathies, if they must be declared, clearly lie with Riyadh. The Houthis are watching too. The Iran-backed movement that controls northern Yemen must view the Saudi UAE rupture with something approaching satisfaction. For years, they faced a united coalition. Now their enemies are fighting each other. The divisions that split the anti-Houthi front only strengthen the Houthi position. A peace deal between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis now seems more likely. Riyadh has been negotiating with the group for years, seeking an end to the war that has cost billions and achieved little, with the UAE and its proxies now designated as enemies rather than allies. The calculus has shifted. A deal that leaves the Houthis in control of the north while Saudi Arabia dominates the east may be more attractive than continuing a three-way conflict. But peace with the Houthis does not mean peace for Yemen. The southern question remains unresolved. The STC's dream of independence has not died with al-Zubayd's flight. The grievances of southern Yemenis, their sense of marginalization, their memory of statehood, their resentment of northern domination will not disappear because Saudi Arabia has asserted its authority. Yemen's future may be partition, not the clean division the Santisi envisioned, with an independent South Yemen controlling everything from Aden to Al-Mara, something messier. A Houthi north, a contested south, spheres of influence carved out by external powers, a failed state that persists in name while fragmenting in fact. This is what great power competition does to small nations. Yemen was poor and troubled before the intervention. It is shattered now, and the powers that shattered it are not fighting to put it back together. They are fighting over the pieces. The smoke has cleared over Mukalla port. The burned vehicles have been removed. The damaged containers hauled away. The ships that never completed their delivery have become footnotes in a conflict that grows more complex by the day. But the rupture they represent is far from healed. Saudi Arabia and the UAE remain the two most powerful Arab nations. Their economies are intertwined. Their royal families have personal relationships spanning generations. The complete collapse of their alliance is in neither country's interest. And yet, the accusations that have been made cannot be easily withdrawn. The strikes that have been launched cannot be unlaunched. The proxies that have been armed will not disarm simply because their patrons have had a falling out. The infrastructure of competition, the bases, the ports, the networks of influence will not disappear. The relationship has entered a new phase, not open warfare, but not alliance either. Something more like great power competition. Two states with overlapping interests and conflicting ambitions, cooperating where they must and competing where they can, each watching the other with suspicion that was once reserved for enemies. For Yemen, the consequences are catastrophic. Another chapter of violence in a war that has already produced one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. Another layer of complexity in a conflict that defies simple resolution. Another demonstration that the country's future will be decided by foreigners pursuing foreign agendas. For the region, the consequences are unpredictable. The Gulf Cooperation Council, already weakened by the Qatar blockade and its aftermath, now faces a far more serious challenge. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE cannot maintain their partnership, the entire architecture of Gulf security is called into question. For the world, the consequences are a reminder. Alliances are not permanent. Interests shift. Friends become rivals. The partnerships that seem unshakable in one decade can fracture in the next. The certainties of international relations are less certain than they appear. The port of Mukalla has seen centuries of commerce and conflict. Empires have risen and fallen along these shores. Ships have carried goods and warriors, spices and weapons, dreams and destructions. The sea does not remember. The sand does not judge. Only the people bear the scars. Tonight, the port is quiet. The vessels come and go as they always have. The fishermen cast their nets. The traders negotiate their deals. Life continues, as it must, in the spaces between the ambitions of the powerful. Somewhere in Abu Dhabi, Adarus, Al-Zubadi waits. Somewhere in Riyadh, strategists plan their next moves. Somewhere in the mountains of northern Yemen, Houthi commanders watch and calculate. And somewhere in the villages of Hadramaut and Al-Mara, in the bomb-scarred streets of Aden, in the camps where the displaced huddle against hunger and disease, ordinary Yemenis wonder what the future holds. They have been wondering for 10 years now. The war that was supposed to last weeks has become a permanent condition. The intervention that was supposed to restore stability has produced only chaos. The allies who were supposed to protect them have turned their weapons on each other. The Saudi-UAE rupture is not the end of Yemen's agony. It is another chapter in a story that has no end in sight. A story of power and ambition, of alliances and betrayals, of nations pursuing their interests while the people suffers the consequences. The smoke clears. The questions remain, and Yemen waits, as it has always waited, for a peace